The new Meralco bill for businesses. It's clear and packed with more information. Let's take a closer look at how it can help your business be more efficient. With the new Meralco bill for businesses, all your important payment details are now together in this sky blue section. The cool color and bigger font make for hassle-free reading. In this section, you'll find your billed demand and actual consumption. Your monthly kilowatt-hour rate is now also easier to track. And so is your load factor, which determines if you will benefit from the peak-off-peak program. If you're qualified to shift to the contestable market, use your bill as proof of contestability. You now have up to 24 months of historical consumption data to help you better understand your operating cycle and plan ahead for expenses. Over here is a comparison of your consumption for the previous month versus the current month, as well as your actual demand versus your minimum billing demand, which can tell you if you're optimizing your electrical facilities. And Power Factor helps you see if you're using electricity efficiently. Keep this number above 85. You'll also know how your business consumption affects the environment, so you can explore more earth-friendly ways of doing business. At the back, you can verify what bills you've paid and what remains unpaid, and see how much your actual consumption and billed demand contribute to your total bill. With all these, you can make more informed decisions for your company. The new and improved Meralco bill for businesses, giving more power to you, starting this September 2021.
Good morning. Welcome to BusinessWorld Insights. Today we are discussing the economic impact of the West Philippine Sea and whatever's happening there and how it affects us. And we have a heavyweight panel today. One of our speakers is one of the government's leading experts on the law of the sea, Mr. Henry Bensurta. Mr. Bensurta is a career senior diplomat, lawyer, teacher, former student activist. He's one of our leading experts on UNCLOS and the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea Dispute. He was lead counsel in the South China Sea arbitration at the Department of Foreign Affairs. And he's the author of The Zone of Peace, Freedom, Friendship, and Cooperation in the South China Sea. As the Philippines' foreign policy approach in the South China Sea. So he's the architect of the government's policy thinking on the matter. And he helped formulate the core legal framework of the Philippine lawsuit against China. He's spoken on UNCLOS and the South China Sea in various fora. And he also authored various articles on public international law. He's the recipient of the Presidential Award Gawad Mabini, rank of Dakilang Kasugo, and Order of Lakandula, rank of Commander. Grand Officer Commander, sorry, for his works in the South China Sea, and the passage of the Philippine Archipelagic Baselines Law. So, welcome, Mr. Ben Surto, and we're glad to have you here on the fifth day of quarantine, and I hope everyone's keeping safe. And please, I'd like to invite you now to deliver any opening remarks you may have prepared.
Mm, Thank you. Thank you very much, Troy, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here and engage on a very important issue facing the Philippines and, for that matter, the entire region. I know I have 5 minutes, but if I can beg for your indulgence, I will make a very quick somehow to introduce and immerse ourselves quickly in a snapshot in terms of the South China Sea and the economic impact. So I have a PowerPoint presentation with your leave. Let me proceed and for the presentation. Uh, hmm, uh, Hold on. Uh, Okay, so economic impact of the West Philippine Sea. Let me just introduce you. South China Sea essentially is a semi-enclosed area. Semi-enclosed because it's really just part of the Pacific Ocean, and it constitutes about 648,000 square mile. It's not independent of the Pacific Ocean. So for those who are asking whether it's part and parcel, it is. And it's bordered as a semi-enclosed sea bordered by several countries, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and China. And just to situate ourselves, we keep on talking about West Philippine Sea, just to segregate that from the rest of the South China Sea. That West Philippine Sea that we have termed pertains to the Luzon Sea, in particular, the exclusive economic zone, if we are going to have some idea of the limitation, and also those waters around each of the features in the Spratlys. Essentially, South China Sea is really a very complex sea in terms of the overlapping claims for territorial and maritime claims. In the screen, you may have a take a look in terms of those maritime disputes generated by the overlapping maritime claims. By that, first and foremost is the overlap in the exclusive economic zones between these countries. We have one in the north, for example, with Taiwan and China. We also have another to the south with Indonesia, but they're so easily resolved. In fact, we have resolved already one with Indonesia in terms of Celebes Sea. We have yet to do that north of the archipelago. But in addition to that maritime dispute, the more complicated one really is the Nine Dash Line, which is a very expansive Chinese claim, almost the entire of the South China Sea. And at the same time, we have those features in between us in the middle of the South China Sea, which we call Kalayaan Island Group. Internationally, it's known as Spratlys. And many of these features numbering anywhere between 90 to 298, depending on who the author is and how the counting method is done. But those features, because they are land features, and in the context of UNCLOS, any feature, depending on the character, of course, they generate certain maritime entitlements. Unfortunately, in the case of the Spratlys and the Scarborough Shoal, one claimant country projects a maximum of 200. And as you can see, it overlaps with our own exclusive economic zone. And so when you look at the South China Sea in a snapshot, this is how it looks. It looks like a spaghetti bowl, a bowl of spaghetti noodles with a lot of crisscrossing noodles or lines. And anytime and every time those lines intersect with each other, they actually mean disputes. And so before arbitration, this is how South China Sea actually looks like. And what we wanted to do is, if there's a way we can narrow or lessen or reduce those lines, perhaps then it will be a key a solution for us to be able to engage in each other and reduce the tension and minimize those disputes. And so this is the reason also why we went to arbitration, the clarification of those features and the clarification of the 9-line. And this is how we look like now. This is how South China Sea, as you can see, it's very smooth. The exclusive economic zones of the littoral countries around the South China Sea is very clear. And if there is a dispute that remains, it's on the territorial dispute on the features in the Spratlys, on Scarborough and the Parasols, and to the extent of for those features that are capable of generating 12 nautical miles as rocks, then that is the extent of that dispute. So just to compare South China Sea before arbitration and South China Sea after arbitration, as you can see on the screen. So from this arbitration, what did we gain essentially? West Philippine Sea, if you look at it, it's about 550 square kilometers, essentially. That's our exclusive economic zone. I emphasize the word exclusive because it is only us who have that exclusive right to explore and exploit the resources found there, living or non-living. Unfortunately, when you look at the expansive claim of our northern neighbor in terms of the 9-line and the 200 nautical miles projection from each of the feature, this is the area covered, which classifies that area, which is about 500 square kilometers, out of 550 square kilometers as being disputed, meaning to say that we have to have the double approval. But because of the arbitration, and this is what's left for us, that is exclusive 50,000 square kilometers. But because of the arbitration and the outcome of the arbitration, we're able to regain 540 square kilometers of our out of 550 square kilometers of our exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. And the only remaining disputed area would be on those features in the Spratlys, which is roughly about 13,000 square kilometers. That means the reed bank is now exclusively ours that we can unilaterally exploit. I will stop there, Troy, and allow the further discussion on this perhaps in the open forum. Thank you very much, Troy.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Benzurto. I'd like to, I think that's a very productive basis for discussions later. So I'd like to move on to introduce our second speaker. He is Richard Javad Haidarian. He's an academic and policy advisor. He's the professorial chairholder in geopolitics at the PUP, Polytechnic University of the Philippines. He's delivered lectures at Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and Beijing universities. Beida, okay. And was a visiting fellow at the National Chengchi University of Taiwan and an assistant professor in political science at De La Salle University. He's also a regular contributor to global think tanks such as the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Brookings Institution, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He has written extensively on Philippine politics, populism, and Asian affairs. His latest books are The Rise of Duterte, A Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and The Indo-Pacific, Trump, China, and the New Global Struggle for Mastery, also by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. His forthcoming book, which is the basis for his professorial lectures, is China's New Empire, to be published by Melbourne University Press in 2022. So, Mr. Haidarian, welcome, and I invite you to deliver your opening remarks to our audience, please.
Thanks very much, Timothy, for that kind introduction. It's really glad to be among you folks and discuss also the West Philippine Sea issue and hopefully the more political economy of it beyond just the geopolitics and the usual legal analysis vis-a-vis that issue. I'm also very glad to be on the same panel as Attorney Benzurto. Actually, as I was telling him a while ago, he's the pasimuno, no? He's the reason why I got hooked on to into the South China Sea issue. About 10 years ago, I walked into a briefing he gave at the Philippine Congress. whereby he passionately, in a very patriotic way, talked about the nitty-gritties and all the granular details of the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea dispute. This is 2011, 2010. So not many Filipinos, not many among us intellectuals or writers were really aware of the gravity of this dispute. So I was really taken by that presentation. And since then, I've devoted a huge part of my intellectual and professional energy into analyzing and understanding the West Philippine Sea dispute. So it's quite something, and it really heartens me that the West Philippine Sea disputes went from some sort of an obscure issue that was discussed by a few technocrats and some people perhaps in the Congress and the academe into the kind of national issue it is today. But of course, our goal here is to elevate the level of discussions and also to navigate our way forward. I only have a few minutes just to set the tone for the discussion, so I really look forward to the question and answer. I just have quick 3 points on this issue as far as the economics of the West Philippine Sea dispute is concerned. I mean, the first thing is that it's really hard to just narrow this down to economics, because the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea disputes are really a meta issue. They texture our entire strategic doctrine and relations with major powers, especially with China. In many ways, the South China Sea disputes are also a litmus test of China's rise, what kind of superpower it's going to be. Is it going to be about rule of law? Or is it going to be might is right? It's also about the strength of our institutions, including the ASEAN, including the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. That's why what happens in the South China Sea is telling us a lot about what could happen in the 21st century, especially if this is going to be an Asian or Chinese century. There's also an aspect of how the South China Sea disputes color our economic relations with China. We know for a fact that how we approach the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea disputes has very much also shaped how we approach China's investments, and vice versa, how China perceives the importance of the Philippines as an investment destination. Let's not forget that under President Aquino, amid the heightened tensions over the West Philippine Sea disputes, the Philippines was not even part of the Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at the initial map that was released by Xinhua about a decade ago, and actually also China did not really promise us much of a big ticket infrastructure investment. It was only when President Duterte tried to tone down the disputes and say that he wants to have a soft landing on the South China Sea issue that suddenly China was talking about billions of dollars of investments in the Philippines, although it's a big question whether those investments will ever really come in the way that they were initially pledged and promised. So it's really hard to also separate the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea disputes from our relations with China and also Chinese investment pledges and the direction of those investments in the Philippines. So that's where it's very important issue. If you remember, on a more particular level, Justice Carpio a few years ago raised concerns, for instance, with the contracts with Chinese investments, and saying that in some of those contracts, if you look at some of the provisions, there's the potential collateral there's a potential for our national patrimony assets to be held as collateral should we default on our Chinese loans. And therefore, again, you could see that even in the negotiation of our contracts for big ticket infrastructure investments from China, some of these contracts have nothing to do with our maritime disputes. They have to do with dam projects, with potentially airport projects and basic infrastructure. But if those contracts have provisions that could potentially undermine our claims and sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea, then they are really tied together. That's why this is a meta issue. This is a mother issue that bleeds into everything. It has tentacles that affects every aspect of our relationship with China. Therefore, it has this kind of multiplier effect economic impact. And that is why, although initially a lot of us were advising whoever is the Philippine president to try to compartmentalize our relations, to treat our disputes separately from our overall economic relations, the reality is that has become increasingly difficult. On the second level, of course, should China move ahead with declaring an air defense identification zone or an exclusion zone in the West Philippine Sea and the broader South China Sea area, that is absolutely going to have impact in terms of sea lines of communications, in terms of flow of trade in this area, in terms of insurance, premiums, and long-term decisions that multinational companies are hoping to make in terms of their investment in ASEAN, for instance, as ASEAN moves towards an economic community in the next 5 to 10 years, depending on how the negotiations will move forward. So then again, you cannot separate what is happening there on the ground in terms of the military aspects of the disputes from how it could affect also decisions of multinational companies, long-term trajectory of shipping lanes in this area, and also the insurance premiums. And all of this inevitably will also have impact on consumers because we depend on trade in terms of our exports and our imports, and especially our neighboring countries in the broader region. And the third aspect is, of course, resource competition. This is what makes the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea disputes extremely complicated, and has injected a lot of aspect of nationalism and patriotism. But what really makes it also a very important issue for us in the Philippines is that this is a gut issue. This is a galunggong issue. We now have debates about where our galunggongs are coming. Is it coming from our waters, then via China coming back to the Philippines? Again, this is where, because it's a gut issue, it has huge political resonance in all countries that are involved here. So in terms of fisheries, we know that 70% of tuna stock of the world, for instance, are here in this part of the world. We know that in the case of the Philippines, more than 60%, by some numbers, 80% of our fishery stock come from the West Philippine Sea. And we have huge communities in Luzon, Visayas, Palawan, who actually rely on the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea for their livelihood, and also in terms of our overall food security. And that's where it makes it very, very complicated. And the problem here is that we're not only dealing with China here, but we're also dealing with Vietnam and other countries who are also illegally entering our waters. And we're also not talking about national government in China. We're talking also about local government units in Fujian, in Guangdong, who are very much involved in propping up militias, right? Maritime militias and fishermen militia forces who are entering our waters and wreaking havoc in the past few years. And of course, the culmination of that was the Reed Bank incident. We're still yet to find out what the hell happened there. But of course, the initial report suggested that a suspected Chinese militia force was involved in the Reed Bank incident. And of course, lastly, the joint development conundrum. I think that the Duterte administration tried to cross the Rubicon and try to negotiate a kind of a joint development agreement, but the devil was always in the details. And the problem is that, and as we have seen that in years of negotiation over joint development or joint exploration schemes there in the West Philippine Sea, is that, first of all, we have to understand a service contract is not the same as joint exploration. A joint exploration is different from joint development. Each of them have their own specific legal, political, and especially economic ramifications. And my hope was that at least when it comes to China, we can try to do service contracts perhaps with our Chinese counterparts like Sinopec, CNPC, and CNOOC in non-disputed areas. Let's see where it goes. And then we can perhaps later on discuss joint exploration schemes. But at the end of the day, the problem here is that how do you square a triangle? The triangle here is this. China has its own claims, which are contrary to the Philippine Constitution and which are contrary to also the Philippines Arbitration Award. So how can we negotiate a joint development agreement or exploration agreement with China in areas that clearly fall within the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone and continental shelf without also violating our own constitution and the very arbitration award that we advocated for a decade ago? So I think this is where there are clear economic implications of what happens in the West Philippine Sea. And let's not forget, there's also an element of time. Malampaya plant is running out. I think within 2 or 3 years, it might run out. So there's a lot of pressure on the Philippines to develop alternative sources of national energy security. But we don't want to have a situation whereby we do joint development with China, facing a time bomb and at the same time under shotgun. That's not what we want. We want to cooperate with China in ways that is in consonance with our national interests and our legitimate sovereign rights. And I would say it's a disservice to the rest of ASEAN and other claimant states if we do a joint development agreement with China that violates international law, that violates our constitution, and gives China the kind of incentive and the kind of boost that they may feel in order to impose similar unjust agreements on Vietnam and Malaysia and other claimant states. So what happens between Philippines and China on the joint development, joint exploration front also has huge resonance in terms of overall ASEAN-China negotiations on code of conduct and also resource sharing in the area. So I'll just keep it there and looking forward to the question and answer. Thank you very much, Tim.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Haider. Just to clarify the format, we're also taking questions from the audience. They'll inform us by chat what the questions will be. You will have an idea what the questions are in the chat section of our box. But I'd like to start by throwing out this very general question to both of you, and both of you can answer if you like. What do you think is China's real endgame? Is it really resources or is it access to the sea? Because my impression is that we are caught up in a superpower game where China would like to deny access to this South China Sea to foreign navies, and they are acting in a way that's consistent with their past behavior, which is they don't like hostile powers on their doorstep. So either of you can take this, or both of you can take this. But do you think it's really a resource game? Of course, it is partly. But does China really want to enforce like a sort of like a sphere of influence in the South China Sea, where what the same kind of free hand that the U.S. enjoys in Latin America or used to enjoy? Do you really think that resources are its game? Please.
Uh, Richard,
Yeah, Henry, you can go ahead.
Richard,
Yes, yes,
Richard,
yeah, yeah.
thank you, Richard. Thank you, Troy. Maybe before I answer that, could I preface my answer first? One, I failed to mention at the early beginning. I don't want to mislead your viewers. The views I'm putting here are really my personal views and does not reflect the views of the institution. So I do not in any way represent that. With that caveat, let me make the second preface. Earlier, I just want to make sure that the presentation I made is significant to the topic, and I want it immediately. I thought I have to give that presentation immediately because to disabuse the minds that the arbitration was made to make an enemy of China or anybody. That's not the point. In fact, the economic connection there is this: that first, if you look historically back, you can see that we have many resources in the South China Sea. We have not gone into itemizing all of those, and maybe at some point we can do that. But in a broad way, there are a lot of resources in the South China Sea, yet we have not been able to utilize or exploit that. Neither are the other countries. I don't think we have even come close to 30 or even 20% of the total resources in a right way. I say that in a right way because we have been destroying it faster than developing and conserving it, obviously. But that said, there's a huge resources available. Yet we have not been able to that. And one of the reasons that we have not been able to do that, and so with the other littoral countries, precisely is because of these disputes that has prevented everybody from engaging in a robust way towards a cooperative way, the exploitation, because it can be done. In fact, Part 9 of UNCLOS encourages that. Yet, in reality, we're not able to do that on the ground precisely because of these disputes. Let me do a quick analogy since we are now in a quarantine and we are suffering COVID. Let's just say that South China Sea is like Quezon City. So in Quezon City, you have people who are sick with COVID, those who are also not infected, so the healthy and the unhealthy ones. Yet, because it's highly infectious, it's very difficult for everybody to engage with each other because of the fear of being infected. And so what do we do essentially? And this is what the government and all of us are doing right now: quarantine. So we try to separate those who are healthy from the non-healthy. And at some point, while we do research with respect to those who are unhealthy, not necessarily to kill them, that's wrong, but we try to do research and apply what is medically appropriate to make them healthy. But in the meantime, the healthy ones, we have to allow them to engage so that that economic activity would continue. And this is precisely what the arbitration did by separating the disputed and the non-disputed. And as you have seen, we have cleaned South China Sea of many of those overlaps and isolating those that are sick in terms of those features that are disputed, because we don't have a solution to them right now. We can isolate them by enclaving them. In other words, putting them in a quarantine. And this is precisely what arbitration. And by having that arbitration there now, we have a large, huge area that we can now engage in cooperation. For example, conservation of fish. Fish is not a political animal. They're not confined in any political boundary. They transcend political boundaries. So the fish that we catch here they roam around. The tuna stocks, for example, they are highly migratory fish. And so it requires cooperation from different countries. And the only way to do that is to make sure that that cooperation is not on the basis that one country is claiming mine, actually. And in that context, therefore, there is a lot of anxiety and fear because that cooperation can be interpreted in the context of you owning what is mine. And this is also true in the joint development concept on readback. That said, let me now go to your to your question, and I apologize for this. I think at the beginning, because I have been engaged on this issue for a long time, the South China Sea was not a core interest of China at the beginning. But it's a changeable. As they say, change is constant. Even their interest has been adjusted, their policy has been adjusted. What was very clear from the very beginning was that there is an expansionist policy that was on the ground. And that expansionist policy was just limited to creating a sphere of influence, a security buffer in the South China Sea. You mentioned the economic interest. Sure, there is really an interest on the resources because the southern coast of China is dependent also on the fish resources, and especially the appetite for clams and many of those uh, very rare species, and that's the reason why they have been harvesting on the clams. So there is an interest really on the economic resources, including natural gas and oil. And that's why Chinese National Oil Company has been involved. But this interest on the resources has evolved over a period of time. And it is parallel to the grand vision of the Chinese Communist Party. Now we're talking actually, when you look at the discussions in the National People's Congress and their policies, there is really an interest to attain strategic parity with another superpower. And part of the strategic parity is the ability the ability of deterrence and the ability of first strike and the ability of being able to threaten not the forward bases of the United States or other countries, but the ability to hit the mainland. Sure, there is an ICBM capability. They have those vehicles, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they're not really that accurate, and they can be easily prevented given the technology that the United States has. And so, if you're going to talk about strategic parity and deterrence and the ability to threaten, you need your submarine to reach the Pacific Ocean so that those missiles could be delivered with more accuracy. The cruise missiles, the intermediate nuclear missiles, they would have that ability to deliver that threat to the mainland. And so what prevents them from doing this? If you look at the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean, what separates them in terms of the island chain? The Philippine archipelago, and that's why there is a need not only to make South China Sea as a sphere of influence. I think that has been where they're almost complete with that. They're consolidating their gains now, and they're proceeding to the next step. And that ability is to spill over into the Pacific Ocean, really. And so that is now the geopolitical interest from my perspective. And so the economic impact is there, and it's always a given. But when you do a modeling, in fact, if you're going to constrict the ceilings of communication, China has already addressed that. In fact, in one model I saw, the impact when you constrict the ceilings of communication in the South China Sea, the implication to China is very minimal. It's less than 5%. Why? Because China already has prepared for that. It has already the oil connected to the Black Sea, and it has already created other access points in Sri Lanka and Myanmar. So they're creating all of these possibilities to prepare the constriction of the South China Sea. And so, to your question, let me end it by saying there is an interest on the economic resource, but that has become secondary to the more geopolitical strategic objective of China. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Haider, is this something you'd like to jump in on, please?
Yeah, I mean, everyone is free to read my works and buy my books, but let me just specify and narrow this down. I mean, first of all, what we're seeing here, I mean, I very much disagree with some folks in the government, among others, who are saying, oh, this is just a fight between US and China. We have nothing to do about it. That's total nonsense. The reality is that, yes, US China competition is a factor, but it's not the factor, right? What we're seeing right now in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea is a concatenation and convergence of multiple factors. In many ways, it's a perfect storm. Obviously, yes, you're right. I mean, to a certain degree, the Chinese are copying what the Americans did in the Caribbean and what the Romans did in the Mediterranean, right? And so they want to dominate adjacent waters, the so-called first island chain from East China Sea to South China Sea. The fact that you have China there makes them feel that this very much belongs to them, perhaps. But there's also aspect of Taiwan, for instance, if we're China to dominate the South China Sea, that gives them more military options should they go for invasion of Taiwan, or rather one to tighten the noose around Taiwan. So there's always a Taiwan aspect to this that is not much discussed. But as I mentioned a while ago, there's also purely economic local government aspect to this. I mean, you have Guangdong, you have Fujian, you have local government units there, whereby it's in their interest to give their fishermen maximum access that they can get, so that they don't create trouble, because unemployment is a big problem in a place like China. They don't have elections. It's really performance-based politics. So in that performance-based politics, local government leaders in China have all the incentives to send their fishermen as far as they can, so that they don't come back home hungry, because they just ran out of fishery resources in nearer waters within China. So that's why we see more of them all across the Pacific, South China Sea, and all the way near to Australia. And then, of course, there's also aspect of popular nationalism. Let's not forget that the South China Sea disputes entered a new phase when Xi Jinping became the president. I'm talking about December 2013, when the reclamation activities picked up. And in many ways, for people who are familiar with what's happening inside China, this was also about Xi Jinping consolidating popular support as he cracked down on his rivals, on corruption, and consolidated his own power. And now he's kind of like the new Mao of China. So there are many elements that came together, and you cannot just say it's this or that, but it's really a convergence of all of those factors coming together. So that's where it becomes very complicated and very unfortunate. That's why you have to disentangle them and deal with all of these issues. It's like a Rubik's Cube. There's no way to deal with this issue if you make all of this issue match on a level whereby we can prevent conflict. And that makes it very dangerous and very difficult. The second thing that we have to keep in mind is this. I think President Aquino also emphasized that many times. The problem we have is that you have one country there which says, what is yours we share, what is mine is mine. This is a problem. So China is not open to joint exploration or joint development within its own exclusive economic zone, wherever that may be. Let's say exclusive economic zone within Hainan or Guangdong and Fujian. But when it comes to the Philippines exclusive economic zone, or Malaysia's or Vietnam, suddenly they want to do sharing and loving and caring. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. You have one country which is greedily imposing its will on the rest. And I'm also hearing these kinds of almost, ethnocentric views like, oh, we were a great civilizations. Therefore, we had our admirals pass through here, even though, Admiral Zhang He was not really Chinese. He came from Central Asia and was Muslim. But let's not get into history. I mean, the reality here is that if China, like other countries, did not have such an expansionist 9-dash line, which used to be 10-dash line view, which, by the way, came from Kuomintang and Taiwan initially, people who took over Taiwan, we wouldn't have the kind of headache and problem that we have today in the South China Sea. Nonetheless, my contention, and this is very much at the center of my forthcoming book on China's new empire, is that China is not the Soviet Union. This is not Stalin's Russia, on the march to invade and conquer the world. Thankfully, China is still, if you look at their grand strategy, there's tremendous amount of flexibility and pragmatism. I mean, just look at the South China Sea up until today. I think Henry can talk about this. Both of us have dealt with our friends from China, academics, diplomats, among others. Up until today, they have not given us the clear coordinates of their 9-dash line claim. They don't tell us where it ends, where it starts. That's why friends in Indonesia are also pissed off. Like, wait, does your 9-dash lines, the tip of the tongue, also hit into the North Natuna Sea? I'm not sure about that. So now even Indonesia is being dragged into the issue. So there's a lot of ambiguity about China's claims. Now, that's very worrying, but at the same time, it also shows that China's opportunistic and potentially flexible. I mean, China can have a very maximalist definition of its 9-dash line, meaning all islands, all natural resources within the 9-dash line are part of China's blue national soil. That is one maximalist definition. But they can also have a much more minimalist definition, which is they claim the land features their surrounding waters and the fishery resources or oil and gas resources in that area. And then you can have a more medium range interpretation of that, which I've discussed extensively in my works. So China, up until today, has not clarified the precise coordinates of Nine Dash Line, precisely because it is keeping the negotiation endgame open. It is evaluating the alignment of forces, what the Chinese call Xi, on the ground, and depending on that, they press for a claim. So if there is a pushback against China, a concerted pushback, they can fall back on a more minimalist definition of Nine Dash Line. If you go weak on them, you are subservient to them, they will go for a more maximalist definition. That is why it's important for the Philippines and other rival claimant states to stand their ground, right? So that we can pressure China and come up with a final outcome that is as mutually beneficial as possible, considering still the asymmetries in power. And if it were not for the freedom of navigation operations of the US and growing naval presence from European countries and from other external powers, my goodness, it would be just between China and us smaller ASEAN countries. And you know who will dictate the terms of that engagement. That is why it's important for us to support international efforts to uphold rule of law. This is not just about US and China competition. This is about China acting against international law. And this is about us getting whatever help we can so that we can get the best ever outcome out of the disputes on the ground. Otherwise, we can have a very dangerous conflagration there.
All right. Thank you. There's a lot of interest in this topic, and we're getting questions from the audience. I'd like to allow a member of the audience to ask a question. And it's, well, I guess the election fever is in the air. And one of the members of the audience wanted to know whether the actions of the current government have tied the hands of future administrations. Has Mr. Duterte done anything that might erode the position of future current government and also future governments? And is it irretrievable? Can a new president reverse any of the things that the governments have been doing? Very briefly, please, because we're getting a lot of questions. Please feel free to take it. Mr. Haydarian, I'll give you the first crack.
Yeah, very quickly, I'll try always as usual. I mean, the reality is that the rhetoric of the president has not always been helpful, and there's too much contradiction going on. I doubt this is a good cop, bad cop. This is just incoherence and amateur hour. That has been a problem. And when the president says something on arbitration award, it has legal implications. So hindi pwede sabihin na istorya lang yan or joke lang yan. So he has to be responsible. He promised to metamorphose once he becomes a president. He said that in 2016. Well, we haven't seen that. But as far as the Duterte administration is concerned, there are many good things that happen. I think one of the best things that happened under the Duterte administration is efforts by Secretary Lorenzana and people in the Philippine security establishment to actually strengthen our position on the ground. That was my criticism of the previous administration. Like, what are we doing there in Pag-asa and Tito Island to actually upgrade our facilities, to make conditions of living for our Marines, for our people there better? I don't think there was much effort done under the previous administrations, with all due respect. But we're seeing under Secretary Lorenzana's rule for supervision, for instance, that there's some efforts in that regard. We have also, I mean, at least in fairness to the Department of Foreign Affairs and also the Department of Defense, on many occasions, we have made it very clear that the arbitration award is final and binding. And let's be also fair in the sense that we have not lost any of the land features that we have been controlling since Duterte came into power, right? I mean, we still have maintained the 8 to 9 land features that we have there in the West Philippine Sea. We have not lost them. It's not the end of the game. Wala pang knockout dito. So let's not be also fatalistic. But yes, in many ways, if Duterte was a little bit better in terms of his diplomatic positioning, we could have better leveraged the arbitration award to get more concessions from China. We could have better protected our exclusive economic zone to make sure that this massive exploitation of our fishery resources by illegal fishing from other countries, especially China, doesn't happen. And perhaps we could have also avoided the reed bank incident and other kinds of crises there in the West Philippine Sea if we made it very clear to China that there will be consequences if shenanigans keep on happening within our exclusive economic zone. So there have been costs under the Duterte administration, but let's not also be fatalistic about it and lose hope. And by the way, some good things actually also happened in the past few years as far as enforcing our claims and protecting our claims on the ground is concerned.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ben Sorto, would you like to jump in?
Yes, yes, Troy. Thank you for that question. I'll answer it in 2 points. The first point I'd like to say is this: it's very unfortunate that the whole debate has been shaped in a different way, one that diverts rather than focus. By this, I'm saying it's most unfortunate that the focus of the debate on the arbitration has been whether it's enforceable or not. I think it's a waste of time for us to engage in the subject of it doesn't produce any fruit at all if you are going to limit and focus on the issue of whether it's enforceable or not. Rather, we should refocus the direction of that debate into how do we enforce it? How do we implement it? I think that's more productive. We only have to ask the question to ourselves: is the result or the outcome of the arbitration good? And if the answer to that is yes, then it behooves us to be moved by that goodness by directing ourselves, directing our will, directing our power, directing all available tools in our toolbox to focus on how we are going to implement this. And there are so many ways of how to do this. A combination, a policy mix of bilateral, multilateral, internationalization, minimum credible defense. All of these really are considerations by which we can move in the direction of how to implement it. And so I think the debate has to be on that. My second point, it's understandable, and I think this is one area where we have to look into on a long-term basis. It's it, the problem with any administration that is limited by 6 years will normally be on the first half of any administration to be cautious, and that's understandable. I've seen this even during the time of President Aquino. There was a tendency to be cautious. Why? Because you, as in driving, if you're just learning to drive, you don't put a lot of weight on the accelerator. You have the tendency to put more brakes. And then as you learn the roads, as you learn the topography, as you learn the landscape, then you are more much bolder to take a certain direction. And so this has been the pattern that I've seen in one administration to another. But as you go deep into this issue, I think one common principle will come out, that China's policy never changed and they have been consistent. And as soon as you realize that, you calibrate, and so then you calibrate and you rethink, and you try to think over whether bilateral is really the right solution, or you have to be smarter and more creative in your approach. And so the other thing that we have to look into this is the institutional capacity of both China and the Philippines. One inherent weakness. Why do we say that China has the ability to be strategic and long term in terms of its policy? Because their leaders are there for life, and so a necessary consequence of that is the consistency of policy. However, in a democratic state like the Philippines and other democratic states, where administrations are normally limited by that definite term of 6 or 4 years, you normally lack the ability, or you tend to focus on what can be achieved in your 6 years, and therefore there is an inherent defect not to be strategic in your thinking. This is not to say that we are weaker than a dictatorship country like that. No, by no means no. But we have to be smart how to address this deficiency. And one way of addressing this is through the institutional memory. Those institutions that provide non-political but objective analysis of certain situations. By this, I'm referring to the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of National Defense. By nature, they are career, they are supposed to be objective, they are supposed to be professional, and their analysis, because of their historical understanding, and they will have the ability to think strategic. And so there has to be an effort to strengthen these institutions and insulate them from any politics. This is one way, I think. So for every administration, therefore, that comes in and go, they have to make use a lot of these institutions because they provide that institutional memory, that strategic thinking. And I think if we are going to move forward in the future, this is something that we have to look into. My last point here, because I think I have to answer directly your question, whether we have the decision of the arbitration is final and it's legal and it's international law, despite what China says. That said, it is a fundamental tenet that all the parties in the South China Sea dispute must look into. That said, it is still possible that they can be denigrated. For example, we have a law domestically, but if that law is not used, what value is that law that was passed in Congress? No matter how beautiful that law is, if it is not utilized for the right purpose, for the objective for which that law was passed, then it's nothing. And so we have to ask ourselves that question. Is this ruling beautiful, good for the country? Is it good for the region? And if the answer to those questions are yes, then we have to do by ourselves in cooperation with other like-minded states on how we can systematically, peacefully put this in operation. No matter how long it will take, we have to have that political will to put it into effect and make sure that it is not pushed back, but we have to exercise and approach and think of other creative ways by which we can methodically implement this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to make an announcement. I've been informed that we've been extended for 15 minutes. I hope that's okay with everyone. I hope no one has any pressing appointments. So I'd like, I guess it's a matter of judging the volume of questions we're getting from the audience. So we've been allotted more time. So I'd still request, I guess, that everyone keep answers as brief as possible so we can accommodate as many people as possible. So my second question is that people tend to ignore the fisheries aspect of the dispute, but it's also very politically sensitive because of the fishing communities involved. On the Chinese side, my impression is that China has created these fishing militias to to probably test the will of other powers, whether these attacks are taking place officially from the Chinese Navy or from civilians. That's my impression, at least. I'm not the expert. There are two live experts right here. The slide which I googled, again, I'm not an expert, but I'm an expert Googler. The slide which I just brought up is like an estimate of the fisheries resources extracted from the South China Sea over decades, and the yellow number is much larger than a lot of the seas. So the problem is that China has overfished uh, these waters, and so have the other countries. So fisheries are a very notoriously prickly issue, especially in the EU. I think the British and Iceland have fought a war over it. So uh, my question is like, how does one manage the expectations of local communities who depend on fisheries, and how does one move towards an arrangement with neighboring countries where you have like joint management, because what you're trying to avoid is the tragedy of the commons where everyone just takes from the resource and doesn't really allow it to grow. Anyone who'd like to jump in, please, and tackle this question. Maybe I'll give Mr. Bensur the first crack at it.
Okay. All right. Troy, thank you. The issue of fishing for the Philippines is really an existential question. Why? Because the Philippines is a quintessential coastal state. By that, I mean more than 60 out of 71 provinces in the Philippines are really coastal. By coastal, I mean they're within 100 kilometers away from the coast. And therefore, by looking at that figure, you can more or less sense the number of our population that are that is highly dependent on the fish resources. And so it is not just a resource that's part of our leisure or pleasure. It's something that goes into the very heart of our existence. And so for that matter is something that's very critical for our existence and our national security as well. That said, I wish to go back. How do we ensure that they're able to fish? Obviously, it's a combination of factors, but a very good starting point here is a definition and a clarity in the area where they could fish. And obviously, in this context, we have to understand that this is the very purpose of an exclusive economic zone. And that's why the word exists, exclusive, meaning to say that within that range of 200 from the baseline of the Philippines, that 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone is exclusively reserved for Filipinos to enjoy in terms of exploitation and exploitation of all resources there, living and non-living. To be practical, the fish. And so in the past, before arbitration, there is a lack of clarity in terms of that 200 because they overlap. As I mentioned, even if we have an exclusive economic zone that is in the range of something like 550 square kilometers, nonetheless, about 500 square kilometers of that 550 has been categorized as disputed precisely because of the 9-dash line. The arbitration has already clarified this, and it's now very clear that our exclusive economic zone, exclusive that is not disputed and cannot be disputed, even with the 9-dash line, is about 500 square kilometers. And so we have to be able to make this clear in terms of our fishermen, the areas where can they engage. I suspect that our people, many of our people, understand the ruling, just a ruling, and that's it. But really never understood the practical implications of those 15 submissions that we won over the ruling. And part of that 15 submission is our exclusive economic zone, 550 square kilometers. And so what is the implications of that? Our people, our fishermen they have the exclusive right to go there without fear. Second, Chinese fishermen do not have uh, any rights to fish there unless we allow them. The area that is disputed is limited to 13,000 square kilometers on those peripheral rock features in the Spratlys. That's 13,000 square kilometers as opposed to 500 square kilometers. And when you look at the fish resources, and because it's a marine, it's a large, highly diverse marine ecosystem there in the Luzon Sea. And so this is what we have to tell our fishermen, and government can complement this exclusive economic zone by extending that protection. Chinese coast guards, the white vessels, whether it's white or gray, they may have the right of freedom of navigation even in our exclusive economic zone. That's law. Nonetheless, that said, they have no right to conduct sovereignty patrol in the area. And so the implications of that ruling is not, they cannot fish and they have to respect our rights. In fact, that's a very clear ruling of the tribunal. And second, those sovereignty patrols have to stop. They cannot do sovereignty patrols in our own exclusive economic zones. Their coast guards cannot be in our exclusive economic zone because the very nature of a white vessel is law enforcement. How can you enforce a law that is outside of your sovereign right? And so maybe I should stop there, but I think that has to be a starting point for any discussion on our ability to fish in our area. And I have not even discussed, we have not even come into the actual figures and statistics in terms of the number of fish in that area. You will be surprised how rich that area is and how much. But the second point to this is how much China has destroyed that ecosystem and that marine environment when they have destroyed more than 300 hectares of coral reefs. And those coral reefs they are critical components in the symbiotic relationship in the link of these different ecosystems, where highly migratory fish and pelagic fish are highly dependent on. Maybe I'll stop there, Richard, your take.
All
Sorry.
right, Richard. Since that was a very comprehensive answer, I'd like to maybe change the spin of the question a little when it comes to you. Since fisheries are a very emotional issue, how does a government manage to communicate to its people? Look, where we've got a problem dealing with this very powerful neighbor, and I hope you understand, while still asserting its own rights. It has the potential to bring down governments when your people starve. So, how would you advise the government on managing popular issues like fisheries? Because fisheries, everyone understands you can fish, you can eat, but people might not understand the deep diplomatic background backstory, how to manage a restive population like that.
Yeah, I mean, my first advice to any head of state is not to echo the talking points of a foreign country's, foreign ministry, right? So we saw that unfortunately during Reed Bank, right? A normal maritime incident, a small maritime incident is like, whoa, it sounds very familiar. It sounds very the same. Maybe that's a big no-no, right? You don't do that. That's very, very important, right? Well, I mean, let's just put things in the numbers. I think Dr. Batumbakal and Dr. Onda from UP have run the numbers on the fisheries and illegal fishing. We're losing hundreds of millions of dollars every year due to illegal fishing. Again, not one or two. I mean, it's not just one country involved there. We have illegal fishing from Vietnam and other countries, but China is a whole different level, right? Especially considering the fact that they also control the Scarborough Shoal area, right? So, I mean, it's good for President Duterte to talk about real or imaginary Chinese investments in the Philippines and billions of dollars, but we're actually losing hundreds of millions of dollars because of illegal fishing within our waters. That's a clear number that is actually happening right now, not imaginary investments from China. On the issue of the tragedy of commons. In fairness to China, they do have a fishing ban. I think most recently they had a fishing ban in the South China Sea area, but they unilaterally impose it, including within our exclusive economic zone, including in the Scarborough Shoal. That's a big problem. So thank you to China for trying to make sure that nothing runs out of everything. But if this is just for the Chinese fishermen and themselves within our waters, that's very problematic, right? I remember very well in November 2016, after President Duterte's visit to China, there were discussions about joint patrols with China in the Scarborough Shoal. So Philippine Coast Guard and China Coast Guard kind of make sure that both our fishermen and their fishermen can have access to that area. And let's not forget, the arbitration award also made it clear that this is a common fishing ground, right? That neither China nor anyone can exclusively impose ban on other countries entering the area. And from what I understand, the Vietnamese and others are also citing somehow our arbitration award to kind of push for their own claims and fishery access in the area, which is where it's sad. Because if you look at the arbitration award, France, Germany, and UK last year had joint statements in the UN. They invoked the Philippine Arbitration Award and made it clear that China's expansive claims have no basis in international law. Americans and Europeans and others are using arbitration award as a kind of a basis legal definition for freedom of navigation or access operations to challenge China. We have other neighboring countries trying to use that. There are proposals that our arbitration award could be a basis for a code of conduct, maybe not between ASEAN and China, but among fellow claimant states. Like, why not the code of conduct with Malaysia and Vietnam based on the UNCLOS in international law? I think that is a much better way of moving forward than these pointless COC negotiations with China, which are not going anywhere. And let me just remind that China, I don't know, maybe Henry can correct me on this, but I've been following this very, very carefully. China is not using the term nine-dash line a lot recently since our arbitration award came out. So it has had some effect. So to say it was pointless and piece of trash paper, again, I hear it from China, I hear it from someone here, that's weird. But China is not using nine-dash line because they know it's a joke. It's a big joke. No one takes it seriously. That's why in 2017 and 18, they had the new doctrine, the four sha doctrine, which was even more comical than nine-dash line. No one bothers to even talk about that. So even the Chinese are acknowledging that, arbitration award has had some impact. Now, China will never openly admit that it's going to abide by it. It will never fully abide by it. But the arbitration award gave us a leverage that we would not have otherwise had, right? If not for the efforts of the Aquino administration, for Henry Bensurta, among others, we would not have that leverage. So we would have been even more helpless towards China. The question is, did this administration and will the next administration leverage the leverage we have, or are they going to denigrate our leverage or echo the talking points of the other side? That is what I hope I don't see under the next president, whoever it's going to be.
All right. I'll throw a follow up question to you, Richard, since you mentioned the European powers. Very recently, the British sent a task force through the South China Sea, and I'm guessing Australia is also getting more involved, and
The
Japan was
Germans,
always.
Germans too are sending. Yeah, they just
The
sent.
Indians are also sending ships. So the Germans just sent a ship, I think. What do you think are the implications of greater outside power involvement in the South China Sea?
Well, first of all, it's a sad reflection of the fact that we're not doing enough. You have a situation whereby it seems some foreign powers want to defend Scarborough Shoal more than some people here, right? That's a problem, right? That's a problem. You, what's happening here is that the ASEAN is not stepping up to the plate. And it's not true that ASEAN is ineffectual. If you go back to the history of ASEAN, what they did during Cold War, in the case of Cambodia, in the case of East Timor, ASEAN did a lot. Back in the days, we had decisive leaders. There were the Mahatirs and Lee Kuan Yews. We had great foreign ministers and diplomats. Today's ASEAN, I'm not very sure about that, right? So today's ASEAN is not stepping up to the plate the way that the first generation of ASEAN leaders step up to the plate in the Cold War. So that is why the Quad powers, the Quad plus powers, the the Europe 3 powers are stepping in and saying, well, if you're not going to do your job, we're going to do that job for you. And the reality is that these powers also have an interest in this area, right? The French and the British have actually territories in the Indo-Pacific. The Germans want to be a quote-unquote shaping power. They have economic interest in this part of the world. They're not happy about some of the excessive and coercive behavior of China. Now, the reality is this. Each of these external powers will only go to a certain degree. At the end of the day, the heavy lifting should come from us because at the end of the day, this is about our sovereign rights. But the Americans, for instance, and this is where I kind of not disagree with Henry, but I want to give it a more positive tone because the good thing about democracy is that we can correct previous administration. The bad thing with dictatorship is that once they're stuck with the bad dictator, they're stuck with bad policy and they're doomed. We should know that. We had a history of that. But in democracies, we can correct. At the same time, in democracies, you can also have good continuity. So if you look at Biden and Trump, Biden is as tough on China. If you want US to be tough on China, that's a good thing. But Biden is also correcting some of the excesses of the Trump administration. So a good thing with democracy is that we can review what happened in the past and actually improve upon that, something that cannot happen under dictatorship. So we have a room to actually improve on our strategy. Now, going back to the issue of Europe, the Americans go within the 12 nautical miles of the fake islands that the Chinese built, saying to them in your face, this is fake island, you have no rights here. The Europeans are not going to do that. They're going to be a little bit 24, 16 nautical miles away. But my idea is that the cumulative effect of multiple powers coming in and telling to China, hey, maybe you want to care about international law a little bit of too. I think the cumulative impact could be positive if it is coupled with good diplomacy. But if this is just about sending more warship and more warships, we're looking at a very dangerous escalation and militarization. That is why engagement with China is important. That is why it's important for Europeans and Quad powers and US, together with key powers in ASEAN, to come up with a common strategy to tell China, if you want to be a respectable leader in this part of the world, you have to regain our trust and confidence. And one way to do that is a little bit tone down some of your excesses there in the South China Sea and move towards a much more international rule-based order in the area. I think that is what we're trying to do here. So to dismiss what the Europeans are doing as interference or as ineffectual misses the point, because it's a cumulative effect of more and more external powers coming in and telling China what you're doing is wrong. That has got China's attention. And China clearly is very pissed off with a lot of things happening. They're not even allowing, I think, the Bayern frigate of Germany to pass through Shanghai for a port visit. So clearly they got the attention of China, and sometimes you need to get their attention if you want things to get done on the ground.
All right. Thank you. Would you like to jump in on this point, Mr. Bensurta?
Yes, it's a very interesting. Well, before I answer that directly, thank you for that clarification, Richard. Lest I be misunderstood, by no means am I criticizing a democracy. I am for democracy, and we should be. But it's
Now,
also
just say
good to
let's not
mention.
overestimate dictatorship too, right? I mean, like that's my
Right,
point.
right, right.
Let's
We
not
should not go into
underestimate
that
ourselves. Yeah,
direction.
yeah,
Right, but I'm just simply pointing out that in the context of an imperfect world, knowing the weaknesses of that imperfect
yeah,
world, there are solutions to that, and
yeah,
so the solution to have a stable policy, really, from my perspective, is the strengthening of institutions that contribute in the policy formulation and understanding of a certain issue. So that was the and but I'm glad that you raised that, because I mean, we could be misunderstood. By no means are we
yeah,
suggesting we should go into that direction. That's it. To answer the question, I think the Europeans already realized two things that come into play here. Why Europeans are getting involved, and the first is that it has something to do with the fabric, the very core matter of what international relations is. International relations for a very long time has been anchored on the principle of rule of law, essentially, and it's an imperfect system, but we were able to survive, and that has kept peace for a long time. And in the absence of a perfect solution, this has provided some basis of stability and peace for the international relations. And therefore, if that very fabric, that very core element of international relations collapse, that international relations will fall into an anarchy. And therefore, it is in the interest of all the community members that constitute that community of nations to protect that concept of rule of law. So how do we now connect it to the South China Sea? And how is it that it is a mindset? And this was very critical on the issue of Scarborough Shoal. Before the Scarborough Shoal fiasco, there has been a debate, for sure, among policymakers in Beijing as to what is the right way of handling things. There may be a hawk part, and the hawkish and the dovish. And but when Scarborough fell, actually, then it gives the idea that the policy of aggression is the right policy, because it delivers you immediate dividend on your policy. And so this is a dangerous point. And the international community, US in particular, saw this, because what has transpired in Scarborough will be replicated, because it's a mindset. And that's why we kept on saying the dispute in the South China Sea is not just the dispute on the rocks. It is a dispute on mindsets, on what is the right mindset that people and policymakers and governments should have in relation to maintenance of peace and pursuance of their national interests. And so, going back to the Scarborough Shoal, when that happened, it was predictable, and we did predict this, anticipate this, and told our counterparts that this mindset of aggression is going to spill over in other areas, because that mindset that you carry in one area will obviously be the same mindset, that bravado, that aggression. And true enough, months after Scarborough, Senkaku Island was threatened. And by this time, the international community has already learned. And so you can see the shift in the policy of the United States, a more robust, a much clearer policy. In the context of the European nation, they tried to be to distance themselves at the beginning, but uh, in in the context of that mindset, look what happened in Crimea, in Ukraine, in terms of Russia. And so what they have found out essentially is that mindset of a rogue state, or that mindset of aggression, if we don't raise our opinion, our voice, is going to spill over. True enough, the same aggression happened in Crimea. And that was a learning point also for the Europeans, that wherever the concept of rule of law is threatened, they must, as members of the community of nations, express their dissatisfaction, their opposition to that. And this has been the level of debate that has now dominated. Second, it became clearer for the European nations in terms of the role that they play. In the past, because of the lack of clarity in the area of dispute in the South China Sea, it's very difficult for any powers or any community nations, any member of the community of nations, to engage, because they don't know what is the right thing to do. because they're so enmeshed. But with the clarity that the tribunal has laid out in terms of its 2016, it's very clear what is the rule of law in the context of South China Sea. What is the area in dispute and what is not the area in dispute. So part of the enforcement, and this is very embarrassing on our part, because other countries are now doing the enforcement for us. Actually, what is that enforcement? If we say that this is exclusive economic zone and this is not part of the territorial sovereignty of China in terms of the nine dash line, then other countries should have the right to pass through them. And this is the whole concept of Freedom of Navigation Act by the United States, because they should, and other countries for that matter, should be able to pass through in areas where they are allowed under the concept of freedom of navigation. And so, why is this important? This is important because I said we go back to Sun Tzu's Art of War. It's not a battle of attrition. It's a battle of mindsets. It's a battle of habits. So if the international community develop the habit that they cannot pass through there because China will threaten them, that's very dangerous, because over a period of time, that habit will become a norm. And when it becomes a norm, then in the future, we will no longer be able to get it back. And so how do you reverse the situation of developing that habit? We must be able to make a habit of China that anybody should be able to pass through that where freedom of navigation is allowed. But at the same time, we must develop the habit that it is right and is lawful and it is legitimate that I be there and pass through that. And the only way you can do this is not by theory, but by actual actions on the ground. And this is part and parcel of that strategy. And this actually is the operationalization of that concept in the context of those ships passing through. And to show that this is not a US-China matter, but really it's about rule of law, it's good that the entire international community is engaged in this approach. Thank you.
All right. We've been getting lots of questions. I was actually scheduled to ask you for closing remarks, but I think we've run out of time. It's a very productive discussion. Lots of people want to ask questions. So if you want to engage our speakers directly, I guess you have the option to contact them directly. But as it is, we're out of time, unfortunately. And I'd like to thank our speakers, Mr. Bensurto and Mr. Haidarian. Thank you for this very productive morning discussing this issue. I hope we can see you again in future forums. So this has been Business World Insights. It's an ongoing series, and we discuss issues of great national importance and also economic importance. We'd like to thank Meralco for making this series possible, and also the British Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, the Bank Marketing Association of the Philippines, the Management Association of the Philippines, the Philippine Chamber of Commerce Industry, and our media partner, the Philippine Star. So thanks to everyone who joined us today. Be sure to tune in to Business World social media pages to be updated on our next projects. Again, I'm Troy Medina, and this has been Business World Insights. Good afternoon. I guess we spilled over into the afternoon. And goodbye from Business World.
The new Meralco bill for businesses. It's clear and packed with more information. Let's take a closer look at how it can help your business be more efficient. With the new Meralco bill for businesses, all your important payment details are now together in this sky blue section. The cool color and bigger font make for hassle-free reading. In this section, you'll find your billed demand and actual consumption. Your monthly kilowatt-hour rate is now also easier to track. And so is your load factor, which determines if you will benefit from the peak-off-peak program. If you're qualified to shift to the contestable market, use your bill as proof of contestability. You now have up to 24 months of historical consumption data to help you better understand your operating cycle and plan ahead for expenses. Over here is a comparison of your consumption for the previous month versus the current month, as well as your actual demand versus your minimum billing demand, which can tell you if you're optimizing your electrical facilities. And Power Factor helps you see if you're using electricity efficiently. Keep this number above 85. You'll also know how your business consumption affects the environment, so you can explore more earth-friendly ways of doing business. At the back, you can verify what bills you've paid and what remains unpaid, and see how much your actual consumption and billed demand contribute to your total bill. With all these, you can make more informed decisions for your company. The new and improved Meralco bill for businesses, giving more power to you, starting this September 2021.